Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we cut through the noise to bring you the most critical insights on today's pressing issues. Recent court decisions are really reshaping America's immigration landscape.
They certainly are. And there's this persistent full court press trying to redefine national security and border policies, too.
Exactly. And it's not just abstract talk. We've seen it play out in some pretty significant cases lately, like that Columbia grad student Mahmoud Khalil, deported after a judge basically backed the administration's power to revoke visas over national security threats.
Right. And then there was the Kilmar Armando Abrego Garcia case before the Supreme Court. That brought up things like the Alien Enemies Act, which is pretty rarely used, allows for quick removals in wartime, and habeas corpus.
Habeas corpus,
Yeah.
basically the fundamental right to challenge being locked up unlawfully, right?
That's the core of it, yeah. And these cases, plus the whole ongoing debate about just how much power the president has in immigration, what really highlights the intense challenges facing the Department of Homeland Security, DHS.
It's a hugely complex picture, touching everything from borders to our legal system.
Absolutely, it reaches deep.
So it makes you ask, are we really secure? At our borders, in the skies, even, in our homes when disaster hits. Today, we're digging into the foundations of American security, asking some tough questions about where it's headed.
And this deep dive is going to pull key insights from the sources you provided, really focusing on DHS's performance, the big challenges, and what reforms are being proposed.
We'll specifically look at expert recommendations, especially coming from a conservative perspective. Things like efficiency, the rule of law, a strong national security stance across immigration, borders, even disaster response.
What we found in these sources, well, it paints quite a revealing picture for you.
Okay, let's unpack this. Our journey starts right at the front lines of immigration enforcement. We're talking about Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE, and the sources, well, they paint a pretty stark picture, consistently ranked among the most troubled agencies.
Yeah, that label comes up a lot. And what's really striking is the deep decline in morale and just operational effectiveness. The enforcement and removal operations officers, the ERO folks, they often felt like their hands were tied.
How so?
Mostly by policy memos, executive actions. Things like DACA that protects certain immigrants brought here as kids, and DAPA, a similar idea for parents. These programs significantly constrained what ICE could actually do.
And the numbers show that, right?
Oh, definitely. The data shows a dramatic impact. Deportations from inside the U.S. just plummeted. We're talking a staggering 70% drop.
70%, wow.
Yeah, from about 230,000 in fiscal year 2010 down to just 70,000 in fiscal year 2015. That's the lowest level since 1971. And that includes a big drop in removing criminal aliens, which is supposed to be a core mission.
So that 70% drop isn't just a number, it's like a fundamental shift in how things worked on the ground, a real disconnect.
Exactly. And you saw the ripple effect on the workforce. Morale just steadily declined after 2010. By 2015, ICE was rated the third worst place to work in the whole federal government.
Ouch. That's pretty bad.
It is. And compounding this, you had the whole catch and release issue. That seemed to make the problem of people skipping court dates worse. Absconding rates for non-detained aliens shot up 34% in FY 2014, then 43% the next year.
And weren't previous administrations also kind of pushing back against states trying to enforce immigration laws themselves?
Yeah, the sources mention that. Actively challenging states like Arizona, for instance, cutting funding for and even canceling these things called 287G agreements.
Those are the ones where local police help out federal agents.
Exactly. And they also discontinued the Secure Communities program. So it was a real pullback from federal-state cooperation in some ways.
But then the sources also talk about a very different approach under the Trump administration. Critics, like former Judge Paul Wickham-Schmidt and the Southern Poverty Law Center, use some strong language. White nationalist immigration enforcement regime. What did that involve, and what were the main criticisms? Well, according to those critics, the approach basically politicized and weaponized the immigration courts. The administration doubled the number of judges.
Doubled them?
Yeah, and often appointed people with, let's say, limited immigration experience. Many came from prosecutorial backgrounds. The argument from critics was that this led to bigger backlogs and potentially biased outcomes.
Is there an example of that?
The sources cite one judge, Matthew O'Brien, who reportedly had a 96.4% asylum denial rate, significantly higher than his colleagues, apparently.
96%.
And retired judges, like Schmidt and Jeffrey Chase, really condemned these appointments, called them a fraud on American justice, said the appointees weren't qualified to be fair and impartial. Strong words.
Fraud on American justice. That's incredibly strong coming from former judges.
So Given these deep divisions, how do the proposed conservative reforms address this? Do they tackle the impartiality issue or aim somewhere else? The Heritage Foundation recommendations focus mainly on empowering ICE and streamlining the system. First, they suggest defunding those presidential executive actions they see as weakening immigration laws and doing things to boost ICE morale.
Okay, what else?
They want to strengthen that 287G program more funding and actually requiring DHS to make agreements if states or localities ask for them.
So more state involvement.
Right. And speeding up removals. They propose expanding rapid removal authority for border crossers, clarifying part of the Immigration and Nationality Act, and reforming that Wilberforce Trafficking Victims Act from 2008.
Why reform that one?
The argument is that while it was meant to protect victims, it's been applied too broadly and slows down legitimate removals. They also call for just more people, more ERO officers, prosecutors, legal staff.
And getting people to actually show up for court.
Yeah, that's key. They recommend more detention beds and better alternatives to detention like GPS ankle bracelets. Basically, ways to ensure people appear. Heritage suggests about $7 billion for ICE, plus more for DOJ judges and staff to handle it all.
Okay, so that's ICE. But beyond that, the sources mention this invisible wall strategy. Sounds less about actual walls and more bureaucratic.
Exactly. It was a systemic effort using red tape, not bricks and mortar, to trip and cut both legal and illegal immigration. Think altered internal manuals, longer forms, website changes without notice, new policy memos.
Just making everything harder.
Pretty much. And the impact was noticeable. Denials for skilled worker visas, H-1Bs, more than doubled. Citizenship wait times doubled. Processing times for all visas jumped 46%, even while fewer people were applying. The takeaway is using administrative tweaks to create a kind of chilling effect.
Wow. That's a lot of hurdles. And it sounds like it wasn't just aimed at illegal immigration, but legal immigrants got caught up too.
Absolutely. Legal immigrants, green card holders, students, visa workers, they all faced more scrutiny, like a stricter take on the public charge rule.
That's the one about not being likely to need public assistance.
Right. And under the stricter view, even things like non-cash benefits, Medicaid, housing aid could potentially block a green card. The Justice Department also went after states giving in-state tuition to undocumented students.
Arguing it wasn't fair to citizens.
Correct. Texas and Florida ended those breaks. Plus, new fees, like a $250 visa integrity fee, and talk of a big bond like $15,000 for people from countries with high visa overstay rates. ICE got more deportation authority, and they even looked at using that Alien Enemies Act for faster removals.
And the politicization of the courts we talked about earlier, that fits into this broader strategy too.
Very much so, yeah. Appointing judges seen as having anti-asylum views, aiming to systematically deny more claims. Critics cited in the sources argue this led to, well, unthinkable cruelty, family separations, human misery, and a kind of redefinition of American identity. They warn about long-term damage, bigger backlogs, and judges who are hard to replace.
Okay, so we've covered the pressures inside ICE and the courts. What about the actual border itself? Customs and Border Protection, CBP, similar issues there.
Similar themes, yeah. CBP also saw morale dip significantly. They ranked 314 out of 320 sub-agencies in those 2015 employee surveys. Part of it seemed to be frustration about not being able to fully enforce the laws.
And that 2014 surge of families and kids from Central America must have strained things.
Severely. It really stretched DHS resources thin. And the administration at the time often let most stay, which meant more costs, more resources needed down the line.
So what reforms are suggested for CBP from this conservative viewpoint? More walls, more agents.
Some of that, but also focused on efficiency. Heritage recommends ending the 100% cargo scanning mandate. They see it as too costly for the benefit. Also ending the biometric exit requirement.
Why end biometric exit? Doesn't that track who leaves?
The argument is it's expensive and hasn't really stopped visa overstays effectively. They also want to decouple the visa waiver program that lets people from certain countries visit without a visa from biometric exit. They argue VWP actually helps security and travel.
Interesting. What else?
Expanding global entry reciprocity with allies faster processing for trusted travelers. And yes, improving border tech and infrastructure. That includes targeted increases in double-layered fencing, like the Secure Fence Act wanted, about 700 miles or so. Plus more resources for the Border Patrol agents themselves. They recommend about $13.6 billion for CBP.
Okay, let's shift to U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, USCIS. This is the agency handling the legal immigration side. What integrity issues crop up there in the sources?
Several serious ones. One big one is political influence creeping into visa decisions. An Inspector General report back in 2013 found USCIS officials felt pressured to approve applications that maybe should have been denied.
Pressure from where?
It wasn't always specified, but emails showed DACA background checks got moved to a lean and late system, and the DHS IG found the former USCIS head, Alejandro Mayorkas, actually exerted improper influence in some EB-5 investor visa cases involving high-ranking political figures.
That sounds bad, undermining the whole process.
Exactly. It's just political interference. Then there's Fry. An unreleased 2005 report suggested maybe 70% of asylum cases had fraud indicators.
70%.
That's the figure cited. And despite asylum claims more than doubling between FY 2010 and 2014, apparently there haven't been any comprehensive fraud checks since 2008. That's a huge gap.
Definitely. Any other issues?
Funding is one. Only E-Verify, the system for employers checking work status, gets regular appropriations. Other functions depend on visa fees, which can go up and down. And finally, the way USCIS approaches integration. Critics say its strategic plan focuses too much on multiculturalism and diversity instead of patriotism, American principles, and civic education. They argue that hinders real assimilation.
So, given all that political influence, fraud, funding, the approach to assimilation, what reforms are being pushed?
Well, both Heritage and Trump administration initiatives push for pretty robust changes, rejecting political influence, requiring IG investigations into any pressure on employees, making sure vetting is thorough, especially for refugees, restarting those comprehensive fraud evaluations.
What about E-Verify?
Strengthening it against identity theft, making the Social Security Administration work with E-Verify to flag suspicious SSN use. Reforming the funding, moving more functions to regular appropriations so they're not dependent on visa fees, and then retooling that whole integration effort.
Focusing more on
Patriotism, American principles, civics promoting real assimilation, as they put it, rather than multiculturalism.
And part of that was toughening the citizenship test itself, right?
Precisely. The USCIS director at the time, Joseph Edlow, said the test wasn't very hard and didn't really match the spirit of the law about assimilation. So the Trump administration upped the number of possible questions to 128, and you needed to get 12 out of 20 right instead of fewer before.
Any other reforms for USCIS?
Yeah, changing the H-1B skilled worker visa lottery, replacing it with a weighted selection based on salary or seniority, trying to get truly scarce talent. Revisiting that public charge rule to be stricter, possibly including non-cash benefits. Implementing those visa integrity fees we mentioned, like the $250 fee and the proposed $15,000 bond for high overstay countries, and challenging in-state tuition for undocumented students, arguing it's unfair to citizens. Heritage suggests $3.7 billion for USCIS to do all this.
Okay, immigration obviously gets a lot of attention, but DHS does much more. What about protecting us here at home when disaster strikes? Let's talk about FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency. What are the problems identified there?
The big criticism leveled at FEMA and these sources is over-federalization. Basically, the federal government getting involved too much, too often. Historically, states and locals handled most disasters.
But that changed.
Drastically, yeah. Under Presidents Bush, W, and Obama, federal disaster declarations jumped way up, averaging around 130 a year, compared to just 28 under Reagan. The Stafford Act, the main law for federal aid, shifts at least 75% of the cost to federal taxpayers. And the trigger for getting a declaration can be really low, sometimes less than $1 million for a whole state.
And the National Flood Insurance Program, NFIP, that sounds like a mess too. Like, it actually encourages people to build in risky places.
That's exactly the criticism. It was supposed to reduce disaster payouts, but by offering subsidized insurance, it's effectively encouraged building in flood zones. The result, about $23 billion in taxpayer bailouts by 2015. The GAO found FEMA missed out on maybe $11 to $17 billion in premiums between 2002 and 2013 because of the subsidies. Critics say it's financially unsustainable and incentivizes bad decisions.
So how do the proposed reforms aim to fix FEMA, make it more responsible, less of a federal burden?
The main idea is to shift responsibility back. Reduce the federal share for most disasters down to 25%. Only for truly huge catastrophes, say, over $5 billion would the federal share go up, capped at 75% for disasters over $20 billion.
And make it harder to get a declaration in the first place.
Right. Modify the Stafford Act, raise the minimum dollar threshold to $5 million, maybe up to $50 million, plus a per capita threshold. Consolidate grant programs, focus funding based on risk, and cancel some specific firefighter grant programs seen as ineffective.
What about that flood insurance program?
Phase it out, essentially. Transition almost everyone to private insurance within about 4 years. keep NFIP only for rare cases where private insurance isn't available, and charge fair market prices. Heritage puts the FEMA budget recommendation at $13.5 billion with these changes.
Okay, let's move on to the U.S. Coast Guard. What's the situation there according to the sources? Sounds like funding issues.
Big time. The main criticisms are unstable and inadequate budgets. This strains their ability to operate and makes buying new ships and equipment inefficient. Funding for new cutters like the Offshore Patrol Cutter, OPC, and Fast Response Cutter, FRC, keeps falling short.
Any other gaps?
Surveillance is a big one. They lack enough cutter-based drones, or UASs, and icebreakers. They only have one heavy and one medium, but really need at least 3 of each for Arctic and Antarctic missions.
So the reforms are basically give them more money consistently.
Pretty much. Provide consistent funding for acquisitions at least $1.5 billion a year so they can actually buy the FRCs, OPCs, drones, and especially a heavy icebreaker that they need. The Heritage recommendation for the Coast Guard is $10.85 billion.
Next up, the U.S. Secret Service, USSS. They've had some very public stumbles, haven't they? What's going on there?
Yeah, quite a few high-profile security failures mentioned. The Sally's crash in that state dinner in 2009, a shooting cover-up in 2011, the prostitution scandal in Colombia in 2012, agents drinking in Amsterdam in 2014, an armed contractor getting too close to Obama, the fence jumper.
Right, I remember those.
And then those senior agents driving into White House barricades, apparently drunk in 2015, plus privacy violations involving a congressman. It paints a picture of an agency really struggling.
What are the underlying problems?
The sources point to low morale, staffing shortages, and not enough training. The proposed reforms tackle those directly. Increase staffing, mandate more training time, like 25% for the Presidential Protective Detail, enforce stricter discipline, bring in more professional administrators for budgeting and HR, and keep up congressional oversight. The recommendation is $2.2 billion for USSS.
Okay, finally, let's touch on cybersecurity and government R&D within DHS. The National Protection and Programs Directorate, NPPD, and the Science and Technology Directorate, S&T, challenges there.
NPPD reportedly suffers from incredibly low morale, making it hard to get and keep good cybersecurity people. Risk assessments haven't been done well, and even their main intrusion detection system, Einstein, has limitations. It missed the huge OPM data breach and doesn't cover many known software vulnerabilities.
And S&T, the research arm.
Similar issues with morale, but also a sense that their research often doesn't really meet the needs of the other DHS components. People within DHS reported knowing about few or no products S&T had actually delivered for operational use.
So how do the sources suggest fixing these tech and science support functions?
For NPPD, it's about better cyber threat info sharing, improving monitoring systems like Einstein, maybe using data from NIST's vulnerability database or DHS's own CDM program, boosting morale through better leadership and rewards, fixing risk assessments, improving communication systems, and making the chemical plant security program truly risk-based.
And for S&T?
Clearer policies for R&D, no pork barrel projects, focus on what the other DHS parts actually need, formalize relationships between S&T and its customers, also expanding the Safety Act, which provides liability protection, to encourage private companies to develop anti-terrorism tech, maybe even a pilot program with an ally like Israel. Heritage suggests $3.3 billion for NPPD and $750 million for S&T.
This has been a really detailed look at the different pieces of DHS, but stepping back, what about the bigger picture? Constitutional authority, Congress's role. It seems like the president has enormous power over immigration.
That's definitely what the sources suggest. The Supreme Court developed this idea of plenary power, basically giving Congress and the executive almost absolute control over immigration, even though it's not explicitly laid out like that in the Constitution.
And Congress has given away a lot of that power.
Through what's called the delegation doctrine, yes. Congress has handed over huge amounts of its immigration authority to the executive branch. This gives presidents sweeping powers in this area, arguably more than in almost any other field of law. They can decide things like who gets temporary protected status or defer deportations for large groups.
So the system itself concentrates power in the White House.
One Federalist Society source puts it quite bluntly. In immigration, the founding documents no longer control America's destiny. Instead, it's Supreme Court doctrines and, frankly, the dysfunction of Congress that have left the power firmly in the president's hands.
So, if the executive has all this power, what's the check? What's the crucial role for Congress here, especially regarding oversight and spending?
Congress holds the ultimate check, the power of the purse. They have the legislative authority to shape DHS through the budget. They can expand programs, change them, shrink them, or even defund things they see as flawed, inefficient, or just not a priority.
And the Heritage recommendations touch on this oversight role.
Yeah, they specifically call for streamlining how Congress oversees DHS, maybe making it more like how they oversee defense or justice, ideally with one main Homeland Security Committee in both the House and Senate, instead of the current complex web. They also suggest centralizing DHS headquarters physically to improve coordination.
And their overall budget proposal reflects this idea of using the purse strings.
Exactly. Their alternative budget suggests $64.5 billion for DHS, which was actually a 3% decrease from FY 2016 levels at the time. The point wasn't just demanding more money, but prioritizing better within existing funds. It really underscores Congress's responsibility to use its constitutional power to keep these agencies effective, efficient, and accountable.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground here. We've navigated this really complex landscape within the Department of Homeland Security, uncovering some critical challenges, efficiency, morale, just basic mission execution.
From budget overhauls for FEMA and the Coast Guard to calls for strengthening immigration enforcement and citizenship standards,
Yeah.
a whole range of conservative experts pushing for reforms.
All focused on national security, fiscal responsibility, and the rule of law. So here's something to think about as we wrap up. Considering the huge power the executive branch has over immigration and how critical and effective DHS is, what's the ultimate responsibility? Not just for Congress, but maybe for every citizen in demanding accountability and maybe a return to the rule of law for our security agencies.
That's a heavy question. Definitely something worth mulling over long after this deep dive ends.